I am honoured to be able to introduce today's guest. Hilary Benn is an MP in the UK's House of Commons. He is a member for the Labour Party, which is the UK's main centre-left party, and has held his seat for over 20 years. In those 20 years, he has amassed a wealth of experience, including a stint as Secretary of State for International Development between 2003 and 2007, and Shadow Foreign Secretary from 2015 to 2016. Recently, he has been a staunch anti-Brexit force in government and chair of the Brexit Select Committee, but I will try to avoid that subject, so don't worry. I believe I am also right in saying that he is a Tottenham Hotspur fan. So,
correct.
Hilary Benn, thank you very much for giving up your Friday evening to come and speak with us.
Well, Callum, can I thank you and members of your society for the very kind invitation?
No, it really is our pleasure. Great. So I think a good place to start would be perhaps a more personal question. In a recent interview with Matt Ford, you said that your ideal role in a future Labour cabinet would be Secretary of State for International Development. So I want to ask you why that is. But first, could you briefly outline to our largely American audience, what is a Secretary of State for International Development?
Well, I should point out, I don't think I was aspiring, trying to, get my bid in for future jobs. I think the question was, what about that particular role? I think of all the jobs I did when I was in government as a cabinet minister for 7 years, that was the most fulfilling and rewarding. What does the Secretary of State for International Development do? He or she is responsible for the UK's aid and development programme to developing countries in the world. And that is the support that we give for debt relief, for healthcare and education, support to governments on a wide range of things. It isn't just about those questions, helping economic development, because the best route out of poverty is economic growth that enables people to get jobs, earn a decent living, look after their family, getting children into school, particularly girls. That is the single most important determinant of the health of the children that they then go on to have, if that is the case. It also involves dealing with countries where there is conflict, and I spent quite a bit of time dealing on behalf of the United Kingdom with countries where there were conflicts that led to a lack of development and to humanitarian problems. And the other part of the job is being in charge of the UK's humanitarian response. So when disaster strikes, whether it is man-made because of war or conflict, or because of natural disasters, probably the most striking example that I had to deal with was the tsunami in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. Overseeing the response that the UK is in charge of, the help that we give, and the task there is very clear and simple. People need water, shelter, medical aid, if they're going to be there a long time, education, they need food, and we need to get it to them as quickly as possible. And it involves liaising inside government very closely with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, sometimes with the Ministry of Defence, and internationally with the United Nations, the UN humanitarian system, with the European Union, other development ministers before we left the European Union, and institutions like the World Bank.
That's a fantastically comprehensive answer. Thank you very much. So why is it so close to your heart? Why is it a job that
Well, the first thing to say is when I took on the role, I realized how ignorant I was. And I use the word ignorant in the true sense of the word, which is I do not know. Because doing that job for nearly 4 years completely changed the way in which I see and think about the world, including how development happens. Because development is a political, an economic, and a social process. And if we think back to how life was in Chicago 200 years ago, or in London, where I'm speaking to you tonight from 200 years ago, most people lived not very long. A lot of people lived lives of crushing poverty. Very, very few people got an education. There wasn't much in the way of healthcare to speak of. And if our forebears and our ancestors turned up in Chicago or London or Leeds, where my constituency is today, and looked around them, they would be astonished, absolutely astonished by what they see. And they would ask the question, well, how did you do this? And the answer is a process of political, economic, and social development. And that is having ideas like the really radical one. History doesn't record who was the first person to advance the argument, but the first person who got up and said, you know what, I think all children should have the right to go to school. Now, you could be sure if they did say that at the time, people of wealth and power and influence would have said, don't be ridiculous, get back to your place and your station in life. But they persisted, and a voice was joined by other voices, and then it became a chorus, and then it became a flood, and then it became a tide. And in many countries in the world, but not all, it is now the right of all children. But that's not the case in some countries of the world. So our aid program in respect of education, for example, is about trying to ensure that all children have the opportunities that our children have had, and you as students at the university are undoubtedly having. That's the first point. Secondly, an understanding that development is more than just providing the necessities of life. The old saying, you can give a man or a woman a fish every day, or you can teach them how to fish, and they can catch the fish for themselves. And that's why the building blocks of social and economic progress, reducing poverty, are first of all, don't have a war in your country, because the biggest obstacle to tackling poverty is conflict. But even when you have a country where there isn't conflict, is there the rule of law? Is there justice? If people come and invest, after all, we want people to invest in economic development in countries, because that's how we grew, that's how tax revenues were generated, that's how our incomes and therefore our standard of living increased. That's how we came to fund, in the case of the UK, a universal health service that is free at the point of need. Another really radical idea as a result of politics that was brought in at the end of the Second World War by the Labour government led by Clem Attlee. And if you haven't got justice and the rule of law, or you have conflict, or you have corruption, don't be surprised if people don't want to come and invest in your country. So it was, I suppose, gradually for me, it was an understanding of all of the component parts. Trade is the third element, because countries want the opportunity fairly to trade their way out of poverty and not to face unfair tariff barriers or other obstacles. And I met a lot of people, fantastic, committed, passionate people working in the most difficult circumstances. There's so many I could name, but I will name one, the doctor who runs the Panzi Hospital in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who recently received an award, and his name will come back to me in a moment. Some of you will probably know it. And what that hospital does is to treat people in the community, but particularly to treat girls and women who are the victims of sexual violence. And his dad was a vicar, and I asked him, why do you do this? And after he'd taken me around the hospital and I'd met some of the patients, I will never ever forget going into a room where there was a girl of 3 lying in a bed and a girl of 7 standing up. And the girl of 7 described to me what had happened to her. She had been brutally raped and had been internally injured and suffered fistula. And she'd had an operation to repair that. And the same had happened to the young girl. She didn't understand what had happened to her, but she was too young to have the operation. And that's what he does, along with other things. His first name is Dennis, I think. And I was inspired by him. And you're inspired to help people who are doing things like that. There's a lot I could say, but that's my best attempt to answer the question.
It sounds incredible to be able to be a part of the process that you described, to be involved in human development. And so I want to link my next question to that. What's it like to be involved in like an international initiative on this kind of scale. You know, if you're coordinating something with different countries on such important topics, what's it like to be a part of that? And maybe, oh no, sorry, go ahead, and I'll ask the second part of the question.
Well, the more we join together, the more we can achieve. So that is the argument for working above the level of the nation state. And the great conflict really in global politics at the moment is there are two great forces present. One is the desire for control, self-determination, in some cases independence on the one hand, control because people see big changes in their society, in their community. They are not sure they have any influence over it. And on the other hand, what I would regard as the absolute necessity of global cooperation to deal with conflict, threats to peace and security, dangerous climate change, to regulate the way in which we trade. So if one thinks back to the G8 summit in 2005 in Gleneagles, because the United Kingdom was hosting it, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were pressing the other leaders to make commitments on aid and debt relief for the poorest countries in the world. And in the end, we did get commitments. I'm sorry to say not all the countries that made them honored them, but the United Kingdom certainly did. And that showed what you can do working together. To take another example, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, because many, many children die of diseases that our children in our country, the UK, America, do not die of. And working with others to put money into a fund and an initiative to get vaccines out there so people can be immunized, which is highly topical in current circumstances because of the great challenge we've now faced to ensure that all of the world's population can be vaccinated against COVID-19. Or other forms of innovation. Gordon Brown came up with the idea. He said, look, we borrow money to invest in businesses and infrastructure. Why don't we borrow money to vaccinate children and pay it back later? Save lives now, pay the money back later. And he was a great innovator, was Gordon, when he was Chancellor. And I suppose, the United Nations and the World Bank and the European Union are all examples of international collaborations where if you can get everybody together on the same page and marching in the same direction, and believe you me, that takes some doing on occasions, then you can achieve a much bigger and a better outcome. And the greatest example of that this year will be what progress is made at the climate change COP in Glasgow in November.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's fascinating to hear your kind of first-hand experience, behind the scenes experience of these kind of things, these multilateral momentous events in geopolitics. More specifically, would you say that international development and international cooperation on international development faces challenges that perhaps other things don't, perhaps, I don't know, trade or even climate change?
Well, yes, currently, because I look back now on the 2000s as a golden age, really, because the global economy was growing, domestic economies were all in all doing well. Then the global crash hit, and we have seen the rise of the one force I was referring to earlier, self-determination, control, which can easily turn into put my country first, make America great again, America first, being an example of that, but that's not unique. And I'm sorry to say that the current British government led by Boris Johnson has broken with what had been a cross-party consensus for over 20 years and announced recently that the British aid budget, which I'm very proud that I and the last Labour government played an important part in increasing, because the previous Conservative government had cut it in half as a proportion of our national income. And David Cameron, to his great credit, stuck to that commitment, achieved the 0.7% target, and wrote it into law. And then Boris Johnson comes along and says, at a time when the government is spending a lot of money, quite rightly, supporting people in the UK who are affected by the pandemic, of all the promises the government has made, he chooses to break the promise to the very, very poorest people in the world. And I think it is unforgivable. And it means that the aid programs that Britain has been supporting are now going to be cut. And that's a sign of, you know, the old expression, charity begins at home. But I passionately believe that it's not a choice between one or the other. We're talking about 0.7% of our gross national income. That means that 99.3% of our national income is being spent on what is important at home. And I think it is a recognition of our interdependence as human beings. Because if you ask me to pick one word that describes the human condition at the beginning of the 21st century, it is interdependence. Because we share a small and fragile planet together. We may not know the names, and we may not have met all of our neighbors, the 7 and a bit billion people with whom we share this earth, but we are literally in this together. And we have learned to our great cost that if conflict breaks out in one country, it's going to come and affect us. Every time I do an advice surgery in Leeds, I'm looking forward to going back to that when it's possible, rather than having to do it virtually. People who have fled the land of their birth because it was not safe for them to remain there have come to Leeds to build a new life. I think every human being should have the right to grow up, to prosper, to raise a family if that's what they want, and to live in peace and security in the land of their birth. And that is a responsibility that we share to ensure that that happens. But we're a long way from it, because although we created the United Nations out of the ashes of the Second World War to try and tackle the causes of conflict and instability, we have a long way to go if one looks around the world at, I'm afraid, countless examples where the principles of the UN Declaration about the right to life and others are not being applied to our fellow human beings as we talk tonight, or this afternoon in your case.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And my next question was actually going to be about, you know, the appalling change in direction that the Conservative government has taken in regards to aid. They've also subsumed the Department for International Development into the Foreign Office, which I mean is all part of the same thing, really. So my question was going to be, you know, what does this say about the UK's commitment to its development obligations? But I think you've answered that. And so I'll link it to a broader question about kind of our colonial past. You know, the UK once had this enormous empire. Would you say that us and other countries that once had big empires do have more of an obligation to development than perhaps countries that are wealthy but have less of a imperial past?
Just to say, by the way, I looked it up. It's Dr. Dennis Mukwege is the inspirational head of the Pansy Hospital. And I apologize for forgetting his surname. And I'm so pleased when he was honored recently for all the work that he's done. Well, we do have an obligation. And of course, if you look at the UK's bilateral aid program, you will find it heavily concentrated in former British colonies. And if you look at the French bilateral aid program, you find the same. Parts of Francophone West Africa, South America, and elsewhere, Francophonie, that part of the world where there's a particular connection to France. But I think all countries have a responsibility. And you could say China is an interesting example, because China has a very big development program in the sense of investment. Somebody joked recently that there's barely a sports stadium in sub-Saharan Africa that hasn't been built by the Chinese. So they're investing a lot, including in infrastructure. And I'm very strongly in favor of infrastructure. On a visit to Ethiopia once to meet some farmers, I was astonished to discover the price of a bag of fertilizer, which was, enormous. It's about a quarter of their annual income. And I said, it's astonishingly expensive. And the principal cause of that was the cost of transporting it from where it came into the country or was manufactured to where the farm was, because of the poor infrastructure. So improved infrastructure can help to reduce costs. And it also works the other way, enabling farmers to take their goods to market. And another really good example of that is the development of mobile telephony, where, of course, mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, way outweigh the number of fixed landlines. In effect, they have skipped a technological generation. And it means that fishermen off the coast of East Africa, when they've got their catch on board, can ring up various ports and find out what the price is and decide which port to put into to unload their catch. And that helps their economic development and their income. And of course, our aid in different countries is greater the poorer the country is. So the first African country I ever went to was Malawi, where aid at that time was about 60% of the government's income. So a visit from a development minister was a seriously important business for the government. Now, I always say it's not the job of the former colonial power to come in and say, hello, we've turned up with goodwill to develop you. That is not what international development is about. It is about supporting people to develop themselves and their own country, because it's not going to happen without that. And yes, we left a legacy. That is true. Although our colonial legacy, it's still real, but the years are passing. And the politicians of today in every country, they have a responsibility to take the right decisions in the interest of a better future for their citizens. So if there is corruption, here we are, 70 years later, I don't think you can say, well, that's all the fault of the Brits. What are you doing about it? Because I've never been to a country where there weren't any laws against corruption, but I've been to a number of countries where those laws are not applied. And if you're going to deal with corruption, then countries have to apply their own law. And then the job of us, if the stolen money is brought to our countries, is to identify it and send it back from whence it was stolen in the first place. And a very good example of that is we have used in the UK our proceeds of crime bill legislation to, in the case of a former state governor of Nigeria, another thing, by the way, you can do is you should never have immunity from prosecution for currently serving politicians. I served as a minister in all for 9 years. I wasn't immune from prosecution. If I committed a criminal offence and was suspected of it, I could be charged. So why should a state governor in Nigeria at the time be immune from prosecution? And he stole quite a lot of money, brought it to London, bought a number of things, including a very nice house. The house was seized by the state under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and the money was returned to the state from which it was stolen in the first place. So it shows how you need a partnership to tackle problems, problems like corruption. And the final point I would make is that all governments, with the resources they've got, have choices to make about where they choose to invest them. And one of the risks with development is you don't want the populace of the country to turn their attention to the donors and say, will you do this? Will you do that? Will you do the other? Because our government won't do it. That is not how it should work. Go and give your own ministers a hard time. Get involved in democracy, participate, vote, stand for office, make your politics work for you and your community. Because you need to focus on the thing that in the end is going to make the biggest difference. And that's not what the donors do. It's what their own elected representatives choose to do.
That's absolutely fascinating. It sounds like, you've got on the one hand, corruption and kind of government ineptitude slowing things down, but then on the other hand, you've got technology and the unique kind of economy that we have in 2020, which pulls in the other direction. Would you say that because of things like mobile phones, now is possibly the easiest time ever to develop a country, or perhaps the corruption and lack of care of countries' governments mean that that's not the case?
Well, the mobile telephony and the internet era has, utterly transformed the world compared to what it was when I was growing up rather a long time ago. And it provides opportunities for economic activity. I've tried to give some examples. It also is a means by which remittances are sent home, because there are many people who have left their country. They're working in the States, they're working in Britain, they're working elsewhere, and they are sending money back to their families. And mobile telephones can now be used to do that. I'd make this other point about corruption. There's grand corruption where people in power put their hands into contracts or demand a cut or whatever. And then there's corruption at a much lower scale. A police officer who stops you and asks for some money to let you go on your way or charge you for a permit. Now, those things should not happen. But if the salary you're paid as a police officer, or indeed a teacher who may say, please give me some money if you want me to teach your child, the salaries are so low that they can't even feed their own families. So the answer to that petty corruption is actually to be in a position to pay people a decent wage. Because if you or I were in that position and the salary we were paid for a job was not enough to feed our families, well, I'm sure we'd be prepared to do a lot of things in order to make sure that our children were fed. So it's no good sitting on a high horse and denouncing people for acting in a way that is unlawful. You need to understand the cause and the motivation. But when you look at the progress that's been made, and I really don't want to appear to be telling a story of lack of progress, because what gives us encouragement is the astonishing progress that has been made in reducing the proportion of people in the world who are living on less than $2 a day. After all, which country in the world has reduced poverty fastest than any in human history? And the answer is Vietnam, which has developed by leaps and bounds. Look at China. China, a country transformed. I mean, an astonishing place. I can't say I have any time for the political system, but economically and in terms of people's life chances and standard of living, you've seen a big change. There are fewer civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa. There have been more peaceful transitions of power. And that's important too, because it partly goes back to the point I was making about corruption and the rule of law. If you live in a society where you think the moment I step down from being the president or the prime minister, then my enemies are going to come after me, don't be surprised if the person, while they're in the job, is going to try and safeguard themselves against that happening. I have joked on occasion, in the British system, we have developed a well-established route for former ministers, prime ministers and others to move on to something else when they cease to hold high office. It's called the House of Lords. Now, I'm against the House of Lords. I think we should have an elected second chamber, as you do in the States, but it does provide some future or some pension for a former prime minister or president, because people do tend to act on the basis of what they see as their own self-interest. And the importance about the rule of law is, if there is the rule of law in a country, you'll probably be less worried that your opponents can cook up charges against you and try and clap you in jail after you've lost and they've taken power. So all of these things, because you can have the institutions of a democracy, ballot papers, a pencil, people counting, although even that is in dispute given recent events in the United States of America, which I'm half American, and I have to say I've followed what has happened with enormous sadness. And I feel above all for the state election officials who are doing their job professionally, which is trying to count the votes and declare a truthful result. And for them to have seen all this nonsense about a stolen election, we're in big trouble in our societies. Because if we can't even agree on who won, and when I hear the tape of President Trump ringing up Mr. The Secretary of State in Georgia saying, "Can you find me another 11,000 votes?" The very thought that I would ring the election officer at Leeds Council during the night of the poll and saying, "Look, I need another 5,000 votes. Could you just find them?" I mean, it's astonishing. And anyone who tried to do that in the United Kingdom, if the facts became known, would undoubtedly be prosecuted for trying to pervert an election. Anyway, I'm making a broader, but I think it's a very important point, because you have a society in which things that we used to be able to take for granted disputed. Now, that's not to say there are not fraudulent elections in other parts of the world. I just don't happen to believe that includes the United States of America or the United Kingdom or a number of other countries. And the second is the dispute about facts. And I've just, the last email I replied to a moment ago was a woman in my constituency who's had a leaflet through the door saying coronavirus doesn't exist, take off your mask, refuse the vaccine. And she was outraged. I know.
Piers Corbyn.
I know. And I've had a few people write to me and say it doesn't exist. And I reply and say, what do you think 118,000 people have died of in Britain? Why are people gasping for breath in ICUs, in our hospitals? But there's a bigger problem here, which is that when I grew up, there was one television channel. When I was born, there was one television channel, the BBC. Now, there are multiplicity of outlets for news. And some of it is news you can rely on. I'm warming to my theme and slightly going off international development, but I think these things are really, really important. But there are other sources of news where people are told repeatedly that X is the case, and they come to believe that X is the case, even if X is self-evidently, to me and to others, not the case. And then you get conflict, and it's very hard for democracies to function, it seems to me, in those circumstances. So the technology has been a fantastic boon, but like many technologies, it also brings challenges that we have to deal with. And the argument going on in Australia at the moment with Facebook is a really interesting one. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Now, Callum, next question.
Yeah, no, that was, please don't apologize. That was absolutely fascinating. To bring it back to international development, you've painted a very vivid picture of, what's at stake and, the horrible side effects of us stripping our development budget, subsuming the Department of International Development. And you painted an incredibly detailed picture of what it looks like for the countries that we help and what the consequences of this will be. But I might ask about what the consequences will be for the UK. A lot of people say, turning our back on our development obligations reduces our role on the world stage. There's a lot of talk of soft power. Do you agree? What is soft power even a thing? Does it matter? What are your thoughts on
power? Soft power definitely is a thing. I think the combination of Brexit, where we have walked away from one of our most important international relationships with our neighbours and our friends on the other side of the English Channel, and cutting the aid budget, abolishing DFID, because I didn't answer that question. If you look back in history, this is the third time that a Conservative government in Britain has abolished an independent development department. And basically they've said, you've got above yourself, get back inside the Foreign Office where you belong. That's what it's about. And it sends a message. Britain, which I have to say in the in the 2000s and a bit later, because of the commitments that we made, the leadership that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown gave, the astonishing skill and commitment and passion and expertise of the staff in DFID. I worked with the most extraordinary civil servants. People were falling over themselves to come and work in DFID in Whitehall. It was the civil service job that people wanted to do almost more than any other. It enabled us and our ideas to have influence and to build partnerships with others. And I'm afraid the message that is now sent is, this is a Britain, for all the talk of global Britain, this is a Britain that is closing in on itself a bit. And since we've argued for so long that other countries should live up to their aid commitments, achieve the 0.7% target, because it's a very small group of countries that have got to that level, well, you can't argue with that. You can't argue for that anymore, because Britain has no moral authority to do it, because the government's cutting it to 0.5% and saying we might increase it in the future when circumstances permit. And I really, really regret that, because I think it's a terrible mistake.
Yeah, it is pretty sobering stuff. I suppose if we move across the Atlantic to the US, where there is arguably a little more reason for hope, just to frame this question quickly, in 2019, Trump tried to push through foreign aid cuts so severe that even congressional Republicans described them as, quote, insane. Ultimately, he was not able to fully enact his desired changes, but still caused upheaval and overall reductions in development spending. So my question is, as the Biden administration looks to pick up the pieces, do you have any advice? If you were put in charge of USAID tomorrow, what would your priorities be?
Well, I greatly welcome the election of Joe Biden. I stayed up almost all night. And
we didn't.
Well, then we had to wait for the result, and then I stayed up the next and the night after that. And I think, look, those of us who were greatly saddened by what the previous occupant of the White House had done, I'm not going to hide my feelings here at all, felt a profound sense of relief, and pride in the fact that so many Americans had voted for Joe Biden, because I think he self-evidently brings decency and aspiration and determination to do the right thing to the job. And I think he said, this week, this is, the United States of America rejoining the world community. And you can see it in the rejoining of the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, astonishing that the United States of America walked away from that. But I'm afraid that was a manifestation of America first. We, in the face of all of the science, and we need America to be on board. Commitments on aid. My advice, it's not for me to give advice. I would hope to see the aid budget increased, because it's one of the ways of expressing America saying we are now back as an active participant in the global community that will take on our shared responsibilities with others. And it's not to load everything onto the United States of America, because everyone has to do its bit, but it provides absolutely fundamentally important leadership after an abdication of leadership over the previous 4 years, in my view. And I know there's lots of Americans who would not agree with that, but it's what I think. And you asked me the question.
I did, and it's nice to have some reason for hope. I guess to link it back to what we were talking about before, is it of a big enough scale that the US can now almost step into DFID's shoes? Is that how it works, or is development in different countries too kind of different from each other? It's not really.
Well, now it's a very interesting question, because of course although America is the largest aid donor in the world in money terms, in terms of the proportion of its gross national income, it's not. And it's well down. When I last checked, it's something like 0.25%. You ought to know. I'm sure someone on the call will be able to put in the chat what the current percentage is. And the other interesting thing, because I've talked to American colleagues and others about this over the years, and of course there is a very strong tradition in the United States of America of voluntary giving. And I've spoken to Americans who said, well, we don't expect the state to do it all. We have a responsibility to contribute ourselves. But it always puzzled me because, of course, churches are very strong in the United States of America. And the church community here in the United Kingdom played an absolutely pivotal role in the Make Poverty History campaign, which developed in the run-up to the 2005 Gleneagle Summit. So there are interesting political and cultural differences. But I work very closely with the United States of America. A particular example of that would have been the crisis in Darfur, in Sudan, where the Janjaweed militia, egged on by General Bashir, were terrorizing people in their villages, burning them out of their villages, killing people. They came to the camps. The two countries in the world that did more to support the people with humanitarian aid in those camps were, one, the United States of America, and two, the United Kingdom. And it always puzzled me and saddened me that while there would be many protests in London about injustice and conflict in other parts of the world, hardly anything on the conflict in Darfur. And I think some of those who campaign saying we want wars to stop can be a bit selective about which wars they are concerned about. But Darfur was interesting because it was very, very difficult to draw a line between the military, the diplomatic, and the humanitarian. Now, normally, it would be fairly clear, but they all really rolled into one because the UK and others gave support to the African Union mission. And that was a very, very important moment because it was the first time, apart from a much smaller mission in Burundi, that the African Union had taken the lead in putting troops in to protect people in a zone where conflict was taking place. And I very strongly supported it. Indeed, I used some of Britain's aid budget to buy vehicles for the African Union force. Now, you might say, aid money, vehicles? I used money to purchase fuel contracts. It's no good having the vehicle if you haven't got the fuel to put in the vehicle to go out and patrol beyond the camps to stop women who are out there collecting wood from being attacked or raped. And I thought it was really important that the international community, and that included the United States of America, and I pay tribute because it was Andrew Natsios at the time, that we support regional powers taking responsibility for conflict. It goes back to my point about the United Nations, because I've come to the conclusion that with a number of conflicts in the world, the UN may be reluctant to reach a conclusion that something ought to be done, because the moment you do that, the next question is you look around the table and say, right, okay, who's prepared to go and do something? At which point countries might say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I'm busy somewhere else. So it's about capacity. And there are certain countries that have the capacity to do certain kinds of things. You think of what the French, with the support of the British and others, are doing in Mali at the moment. You think of what happened in Bosnia. You think of what happened in Sierra Leone. And therefore, to build regional capacity is, in my view, a way of partly answering the question, who's going to do something about it? And another example of that would be Somalia, where the AU and a number of states have come in to try and tackle the scourge of al-Shabaab. So that, I think, is an interesting example, Darfur, and it resulted in me personally attending the Darfur peace talks in 2006 as a development minister. And the reason I went there, I think, was because I probably knew more about it and I knew the parties better than anyone else in the British government, because the Foreign Secretary has huge responsibilities that are global. And we turned up and we got to deal with one of the rebel leaders. It was quite difficult. But in the end, if you're going to bring conflict to an end, either one side's going to defeat the other militarily, or the warring parties are going to have to compromise in the interest of peace. That's the lesson of life and of history.
What a fascinating insight. My final question before we go to the Q&A is, so we have a lot of students in this audience that are looking to make an impact in the world. So what advice would you give to them in their pursuit to make a difference?
Well, you're obviously making a difference with what you're studying at the moment. And you have an interest in what is going on in the world. Now, when I grew up, I mean, my father was also a member of Parliament. And when we were eating lunch and dinner, we talked about what was happening in the world. When you're little, you assume all families are like your own because it's the only one you know. And I suppose that taught me to do that. Find a cause, whatever it is, a thing that you're interested in, committed to, passionate about, and go and find a way of advancing it. And it could be working in your own community. It could be seeking elected office. It could be being a teacher. It could be volunteering at a food bank. Well, there's an indictment of both of our countries. You know, the richest country in the world, the United States, the 6th richest country in the world, and we have people queuing in line to go up to a complete stranger in 2021 to say, I know we've never met, but I can't feed myself and my family this weekend. Can you help? Now, there's something fundamentally wrong with our respective societies if that is the case. Now, it's not unique to our two countries, but when we see that, we should be angry that our fellow citizens are in that position, and we should be doing everything that we can. Become a civil servant, work in a development department, work in a foreign ministry, because as I said, I was privileged to work with extraordinary individuals who achieved so much, not seen by everyone apart from their work colleagues and their ministers, but who the rest of the world should prize and praise for what they had achieved. Travel, work in other countries, build experiences, campaign on climate change. I mean, there's no end of things that need to be done. And I would just give this two other bits of advice. One is never give up. People say to me, how do you become a member of Parliament? And the answer is you just have to persist, because life does come with disappointments. But the old saying, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again, is true. And the people who get to the top of Everest are the people who don't turn back when they fail at a certain stage. They're able to keep on going. Now, not everyone can get to the top of Everest, but the one quality they have is sheer determination to do it, regardless of the circumstances. And the second is to believe that change for the better is possible. And actually, the story of human progress proves that that is the case. I said earlier, our forebears and our ancestors from 200 years ago would return open-mouthed at the progress we had achieved. And whatever contribution you are making, you should always take a moment from time to time, a bit like climbing a hill when you're knackered and gasping for breath and you have to stop, just turn round and look at from whence you have come. Because when you do that, you see the progress, but it then encourages you to take the next steps to the next goal, the top of the next mountain. And I am an optimist. That's why I get up in the morning, because I believe that we can leave a better world behind when our time is over. And whatever the contribution is we've made, isn't that what being a human being is all about? Well, that's what I think. So now, on that cheerful note, question.
How inspirational. Yeah, so we've had a few submitted in different places.
Okay.
One that's been submitted on Zoom by an anonymous attendee is, can you speak a little bit about what British foreign relations will look like post-Brexit, and if new trade deals could perhaps come with development deals as well?
Well, I mean, the government has gone around the world, as it says, negotiating new trade deals. What it's basically done is to roll over the trade deals we had with those countries when we were members of the European Union. In other words, it's kind of, we've stood still. But what Brexit has managed to do is to achieve the first ever trade negotiation in history, where the country negotiating went into the negotiations knowing they'd come out with a worse deal than they had when they went in. And you can, I mean, it's one reason why Brexit is such a bad idea. No, not because the European Union is perfect, but Brexit has demonstrated that sovereignty was won out completely over the economic interests of the United Kingdom, completely. And I can never think of a country, the United Kingdom's never done that before in history, ever. Secondly, I'm afraid that desire to say we don't want to have anything to do with you, it's a bit like a not very healthy divorce. I really hope that the government will overcome that. I also hope that the European Union will overcome it, because looking at the implications of Brexit, and we're beginning to see those expressed in Britain, our artists and performers are up in arms at how much more difficult it will be to go and perform in Europe. The fishermen can't sell their fish. Businesses, particularly small businesses, are drowning in a sea of bureaucracy and paperwork. This is a Conservative government that talks about cutting red tape. It's just dumped several barrow loads of red tape, cost and bureaucracy on British businesses. So I hope that in the future, the two sides will be able to say, come on, can't we negotiate a better economic relationship? And the one thing about the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement reached between the UK and the EU, is that it does specifically envisage negotiations taking place in the future and supplementing the deal that has been done. Otherwise, the government must realise that it goes back to the point about sovereignty. Because I find this very perplexing. I mean, I don't know, are you in a room on your own, Callum?
I am, yes.
Right, okay, now is there a lock in the door?
There is.
Right, so if I took the key and went the other side of the door and locked it, I would have made you completely sovereign in your room. Right?
But I wouldn't be able to do a whole lot.
You've just pointed out the flaw in the argument. Where does it get you? And throughout the course of human history, but especially now, you pool your sovereignty with others in the interests of advancing the circumstances of your citizens. That is what international cooperation is all about. And you have to realize that, because given the argument that was made about the European Union and the insistence under no circumstances will be subject to any rules drawn up by the European Union or any court judgments, on that same logical basis, the United Kingdom should now pull out of the World Trade Organization, because the World Trade Organization has a dispute resolution mechanism in which the body can rule that you've behaved badly, and the country that's complained against you can take retaliatory action. So it strikes me as just kind of illogical as an approach to take. And in the future, you know, depending on what Russia does, for example, we need the United Kingdom and France and Germany and all of the other EU countries to be standing up to behavior that is not consistent with the values of a free and liberal world, because trying to kill people in Britain and trying to kill opposition leaders in Russia, as the Russians have recently tried to do and now locking him up again, Mr. Navalny, well, you've got to demonstrate that there is a consequence to countries that behave like that. And you only do that by working with others. So, but I'm not a conservative and I can't speak for Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab, and they'll have to answer your questions directly if you get a chance to put it to them.
Yeah, I'll send them an email.
Yeah, I think it's
okay. I think it's testament to how fascinating this talk has been that I've got about 12 different questions that have been submitted.
Fire away then, because I've got a bit more time, and if you're enjoying it.
Really?
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to be rude and keep you.
No. Just fire away.
Okay. Well, someone has asked, how united does the Member of Parliament believe that the future of the United Kingdom is?
Very, very good question. I worry a great deal about this because the Scottish National Party wants independence. In a way, they're advancing the same argument that the Brexiteers did. We want control, and we're prepared to seek control no matter what the economic cost to Scotland. Because it's very hard, I think it's impossible to make an argument that Scotland leaving the United Kingdom would benefit it economically. It would not, it would damage it. And if Scotland were then to join the European Union as an independent country, we would replace the border between the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the rest we have at the moment with a border between England and Scotland. England is Scotland's biggest market by far. Now, I'm a quarter Scot. I think that Scotland has, in my view, the best of all worlds. It has a huge amount of autonomy, but it also benefits from being part of something bigger, the United Kingdom. The vaccine rollout programme. The fact that vaccines are being administered in Scotland is because the United Kingdom government, and this is the one part of the handling of the pandemic where the government has done, in my view, a really good job, and the vaccine rollout is extraordinary, a testament to the NHS. The government decided to buy a lot of vaccines in the hope that they would work, and they put the money in as the United Kingdom Treasury, and everybody in the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, is benefiting from that. Now, that is a really important, it seems to me, lesson of the benefits of being together. But I worry about it. Will the SNP win the elections? The polls indicate in May they will. They'll then demand a referendum. Boris Johnson won't give one to them. And then we're going to have to see what happens. For Ireland, for Northern Ireland, Brexit has also proved very difficult because of the row going on about the border in the Irish Sea, which was inevitable the moment Theresa May said, we're leaving the single market and the customs union. And the unionists are very unhappy and angry about this. The nationalists support the Northern Ireland Protocol, and everyone agrees the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic has to remain free and open. In the longer term, the Good Friday Agreement does allow for a referendum on Irish reunification, but the trigger for that referendum is held by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, because he or she has to be satisfied that there is sufficient support, and that's a political judgment. So I don't see that happening soon. And then the polls indicate that support for independence in Wales is rising a bit, and Plaid Cymru, the Welsh nationalist party, is now arguing for that. For a long time, they said, we're not arguing for independence now because it's not realistic, but they're now beginning to be a bit more assertive. And who knows, Brexit's long-term consequence could be the destruction of the success that has been the United Kingdom. But I'm sorry to say, I think the Brexiteers just don't care about it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a diagnosis that I certainly agree with, and isn't a very happy one.
No.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, of course we do. Go on.
Okay, so Jacob says, first, I just want to say I admire your work on international cooperation. As a high schooler, I was inspired by your House of Commons speech advocating intervention in Syria. I was also. However, during COVID, cooperation seems out of fashion. Boris Johnson et al. Would say that while the WHO was captured by Chinese interests and the EU failed to get a vaccine, Britain stood alone and vaccinated first. So what successes of cooperation during COVID have been missed? What opportunities have been left on the table? Perhaps the Labour government would have taken some of those opportunities.
Well, there's a lot in there. Who's asked that question?
That was Jacob.
Oh, Jacob. Well, thanks very much for your question, Jacob. I think look, on the European Union and the vaccine, they decided to negotiate as a bloc. They got a good price for it because they were offering to buy a lot of vaccines, but they were slightly later in the queue compared to some other countries, including the United Kingdom, point one. Point two, it's not true that even if we had been in the United Kingdom, we couldn't have done this for ourselves. We could.
Yeah.
And of course, the MHRA, the equivalent of the FDA in the United States of America, gave approval to the use, first of all, of the Pfizer vaccine and then the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine before anybody else, which is why we were able to get on and start vaccinating before anybody else. And therefore, we were able to say to Pfizer, right, we can jab. How quickly can you get the supplies over here? And so it began. But Boris Johnson said today we should be giving our surplus vaccines to the rest of the world. And I agree with that, because the UK entered into advanced purchase agreements for loads of vaccines, way more than we need to vaccinate 68 million people, because nobody knew which of them were going to work. So you were taking a punt on a possible success. And the scientists who've done this are extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And there has been a great global cooperation effort. And it's important that it's another example of the necessity of international cooperation, because increasingly the great scientific discoveries are ones in which people collaborate between different countries, because you are pooling knowledge, talent, expertise from all four corners of the globe. Now, there is the COVAX initiative, but I think we're going to have to do a lot more as a world to make sure that every country can afford to get the vaccine and then vaccinate their populations. But it is in our self-interest to do that, because until everyone's vaccinated, none of us are truly safe. And it is a battle at the moment between the rate of vaccination and the virus's natural desire to mutate in order to prosper, because viruses are jolly clever. And they have a survival instinct, just like human beings have a survival instinct. I mean, the World Health Organization, Donald Trump, of course, did a number of things to the WHO, which that's another example of really irresponsible politics attacking the WHO. I think it's done a good job in this. We can get into the whys and wherefores of what exactly happened in China, but you've got a global body. And in fairness to it, it was talking about a pandemic before other people were, and it was giving advice on masks and other things. And we need our international institutions to work for us. And if there are aspects of them that aren't working very well, we should collaborate to make them work better. We shouldn't pull down the whole structure, because what have you got if you don't have the World Health Organization? What's going to happen when there's another Ebola outbreak? Well, there is one at the moment as we speak. Yeah. So that's what I think. Now, how many other questions have you got?
I've got more than you would be able to answer if you had 3 hours. So if I ask you one more, can we make that the last one? Is that okay?
If that's okay with you, yeah, fine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Beza asks, of course, you achieved a huge amount whilst at the Department of International Development, but is
Yeah.
there a project that you wished had gone differently or something you regret not getting the chance to do? Perhaps it's something you'll get to do one day.
Oh, life is full of regrets, and mistakes. Mistakes are how we learn. If you never, if you meet someone who said, "I've never made a mistake," I'd steer clear of them. Well, I'll pick an example. Clean water. Now, DFID at the time had kind of moved away from water projects and concentrated on health and education, which are very, very important. But I remember sitting in my office one day with a team of officials, and we were discussing infant mortality. And I asked a question. I said, what is the single most important thing we could do to reduce infant mortality? And a man called Graham, who was sitting over there, I can picture the scene even now, 14 years later, he was sitting there. He said, well, apart from improving immediate postnatal care, providing clean water, because the biggest killer of children is dirty and contaminated water. And that answer stayed with me. And subsequently, I said to the officials, we need to do more on water. Now, to tell you the truth, the powers that be in the department weren't terribly keen on this, because all departments, all government departments tend to have a view. And they saw it as going back to something we used to do in development, but we've moved on from that to other things. All of the other things were good, but I thought we should be doing more on water. So we did do more on water. Now, you might think that sorting out clean water would be the simplest thing. It isn't. Actually, providing clean water is a really complex business. But the final point I'll make is this, is what is the connection between an adequate supply of clean water and other aspects of development? I was in a slum district of a country in Africa one day, and we were walking on our way from one meeting to another, and we stopped by a well, and there were a group of people standing around the well, but they didn't appear to be doing very much. And so we went up to the man in charge and said, excuse me, what's happening here? And he said, the well is closed. Now, I'd never come across the concept of a closed well, but he then explained that such was the demand for clean water in this particular slum district that people would come in the morning and take the water, and they'd have to close the well for a few hours to allow the water table to replenish it before they opened the well again. And then we spotted a young woman, probably of about 13, who was standing with her bucket waiting. And I got into conversation with her, and I asked her probably a very stupid question, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I'm waiting for the well to reopen. And I said, what about school? She said, well, I should be at school, but it's down to me and the family to get water every day. And until I've got the water, I can't go to school. Now, this was an area in which schools were double shifting because of lots of kids and not enough places. But so I said, so what happens if you have to wait? She says, well, I'm late for school. And what does the school think about that? And she looked at me and she said, sometimes they hit me. Now,
Oh my goodness.
that is life is about particular conversations that you remember. And I can shut my eyes and picture the well and where she was standing. So an adequate supply of clean water, what would it mean for that young woman of 13? It would mean that her family would have water. She wouldn't have to spend hours a day queuing up. and she could get a full and a proper education. And that really brought home to me how one thing is connected to lots of other things. And we had an objective, of course, rightly. We want all girls to be in school because that's where they should be. Because going to school with a classroom and a desk and a teacher opens a window on the world and gives us confidence and aspiration for the future. But the absence of clean water in the area in which she was living was preventing her from doing that. And seeing all of those connections, because development isn't just about one thing, it's about lots of things. And if you can get all of them right, then you certainly can change things for the better.
What a good note to end on. I mean, you've been an absolutely incredible guest. I've got 26 questions that people have submitted. So I think.
Will you apologize? Will you apologize
you
to
have
those?
to come back one day.
Well, you will have to invite me back. Can I thank all of your friends and fellow students for coming on the call, for your interest in this. I've enjoyed the last hour and a quarter enormously, and good luck with your studies and stay safe.